I'm Margaret Knoll of the League of Women Voters of Portland. I want to welcome you this evening to this program about working women's rights. It is appropriate that it's almost Valentine's Day, and it would be a wonderful Valentine to have complete rights for working women, all working women, safety, equality, and fairness. This is also Valentine's Day is the 99th birthday of the League of Women Voters. And the League was formed after a long struggle for voting rights for women. But now we've evolved and we support many rights for all women and for men. Before we begin, we would like to take a moment to acknowledge that we are assembling here on the occupied sacred lands and waters of the indigenous Chinook people. We will never be as effective a steward as they, though we can certainly aspire to be with everything we can do. The League is dedicated to empowering voters and defending democracy. One of our core beliefs is that democracy functions best when voters are informed about issues and engaged in their communities. To that end, we present programs like this to give our Portland community the opportunity to think about the issues that affect their lives and their well-being. We also sponsor voter forums to provide all candidates and the supporters and the opponents of ballot measures an opportunity to make their case to the voters. This program is being recorded by Metro East Community Media for rebroadcast on public access television and will be available online viewing for the League of Women on the League of Women Voters website, www.lwvpdx.org. Our civic education programs are supported by the generous donations from the Multnomah Bar Foundation and the Carolyn Velma Sailing Memorial Trust. We also are grateful for their support, and we also thank our speakers and our volunteers for their help in bringing us this program. And we thank Multnomah County for providing this venue. We are disappointed this evening that one of our speakers, Kelly Kupchak, the Executive Director of Oregon Tradeswomen, is unable to join us tonight because of road conditions near her home in rural Washington. We will miss hearing her perspective on how we can encourage and train more women to work in construction, manufacturing, utility, and highway trades. The moderator for this evening's panel is Emily Evans, Executive Director of the Women's Foundation of Oregon. The Women's Foundation is relentless in its pursuit of a better Oregon for women, their families, and their communities. Emily will begin the evening by briefly introducing our panelists, and then they will discuss the status of working women in the second decade of the 21st century, the good, the bad, and the ugly. What we have accomplished, what we are doing now, and what is left to do. The topic could engage us for the rest of our lives, but tonight's panelists will help us frame the issues that are affecting women, families, and communities today. If you have questions for the speakers, please take an index card to write your question. Volunteers will be circulating to pick up the cards, and the moderator will pose as many questions as we have time for. It is now my pleasure to hand the panel over to Emily Evans, who will introduce our panelists and get the discussion going.
Great. Good evening, everyone. So glad to see you all here. It's a wintry night. I think if it had been a bit colder, we all would have been at home alone with our kale and not here for this delightful discussion. So let me introduce our panelists. We have Patricia Weekly, Director of Equity, Inclusion, and Sanctuary at Morrison Child and Family Services. Esteemed colleague Lily Hogue, Political Director of Family Forward Oregon. And Mari Watanabe, Executive Director of Partners in Diversity at the Portland Business Alliance. Let's give them all a hand. So I'll take a few minutes here at the beginning to just set a little bit of the context regarding the data around women and girls in Oregon. All of the issues that I'll talk about intersect with women in the workforce in some way, and it might help just sort of get us a little bit familiar with some of the issues that are on the table, and then we'll talk about some specifics with our panelists. I'm gonna see if this works. Slides. Yes, just hit. Great. So the data that I'm drawing from is from the Count Her In report, which is the first comprehensive report about women and girls in Oregon in about 20 years. Roughly, I was in first grade the last time we had fresh data. I had the same haircut and the same outfit, but it was a long time ago, and we've been sort of in a data blind about how women and girls in Oregon were doing for essentially a generation. And if you take only one sentence about how women and girls in Oregon are doing away from what we talk about here tonight, the sentence is that women and girls in Oregon are giving more but getting less than women and girls in most other states. Let me put that a different way. Women and girls in Oregon are contributing an extraordinary amount to keep our communities strong and vibrant, and in return, they're facing some of the starkest gender inequities in the nation. And that's a hard truth for a lot of us to reckon with. The report includes 8 things to celebrate, which are just the tip of the iceberg for things that Oregon women and girls are doing exceptionally well. Everything from civic engagement, voting at higher rates, performing extraordinary amounts of caregiving, often unpaid, which is not to celebrate. We'll talk about that more. We're the most physically active women and girls in the country. Does anybody feel like Colorado thinks they're number one? Doesn't it seem like that? I feel like they're very smug about it, but we're actually the most physically active women and girls. Education and healthcare. 70% of Oregon's public school teachers and 80% of our healthcare workers are women. We're really talking about women and girls when you talk about education and healthcare. We're more generous with money and time. We serve in elected office at higher rates. And educational attainment, we met the goal Oregon's girls met the goal for higher educational attainment a decade ahead of schedule. So as I mentioned, this is just the tip of the iceberg for the hundreds of ways that women and girls are showing up for their communities and making life in Oregon better. On the flip side, we have identified what we call the 8 that can't wait. And these are 8 incredibly pressing issues where Oregon is falling behind the rest of the nation, which is already often behind the rest of the developed world, where it's surfacing in the lived experiences of folks in communities. We talked to 1,000 women and girls across the state, and no matter where we were, these were the 8 issues that were rising to the top. And these are also issues where we see a huge disparity between how women and girls are doing in Oregon and how men and boys are doing. I'll briefly gloss over them. It's pretty depressing, so maybe take a deep breath and just go with me for the next minute, and then we're going to talk about solutions when we get to the panel. The first is violence against women. Oregon has some of the highest rates of violence against women in the nation. Over half the women in Oregon have experienced some form of sexual or domestic violence in their lifetime. Systemic racism. Oregon has an appalling history when it comes to an incredibly institutionally and structurally racist past. And the women and girls of color in Oregon, of whom there are almost 500,000, live at the intersection of the racism and sexism that is ever present here in Oregon. The cost of caregiving, which should really be called the unaffordability of caregiving. Oregon is among the least affordable states in the nation when it comes to the cost of caregiving for both child and elder care. And it now costs more to send your toddler to a year of childcare than it does to send a freshman to U of O for a year. Barriers to reproductive health. This is kind of a crummy indicator, but for a lot of reasons that we can talk about, but almost half of the pregnancies in Oregon each year are unintended. Almost half. And that tells us that we have a systemic lack of access and information regarding how, when, and whether to start a family for women and girls in Oregon. The wage and wealth gap. Oregon has the second worst wealth gap in the nation. Oregon women hold only 35 cents in wealth compared to dollars held by Oregon men. We're kind of middling when it comes to the wage gap. I'm sure we'll talk about that. Isn't it sad when you celebrate being middling? You're like, ooh, we're average. Next is economic fragility. This is really a poverty number. Almost a third of Oregon families, most of them headed by women who are single-family head of households, are experiencing what we call economic fragility, which means that if they have a single unexpected expense of even $100, they can't navigate it without selling something or borrowing money. They're living on the precipice of financial disaster every single day. The next is mental health. Oregon has some of the highest rates of depression, reported alcohol and drug abuse, attempted suicides, and adverse childhood experience scores in the nation. In fact, Oregon women have the highest incidence of reported depression in the nation. And finally, I know I told you it was going to be a bad minute, the public-private glass ceiling. We have wild underrepresentation by women in leadership, both in the public and the private sector, and even more egregious underrepresentation for women of color. So as I mentioned, these 8 are taken all together. They're sort of locked in a constant cycle of cause and effect. And if you think about what's holding women and girls in Oregon back, don't think about any one of these issues, think about the web. Because these are all just symptoms of the same disease, which is oppression and inequity. And that's what we're gonna dive more into in terms of working women tonight. Okay. We're gonna bounce around a little bit, and I'll ask a few questions of each of our panelists to give you a sense of who they are, what their work is like, and what their take and lens on women in the workforce in Oregon is in the 21st century. And then we'll have a little bit more dialogue and take questions from the audience. So let's start with Mari. Mari, can you tell us briefly who Partners in Diversity is? I think I might need you.
Yes. I need to turn on my mic. Okay. Good evening, everybody. I know the guys told me to turn on my mic. So Partners in Diversity is a nonprofit organization. We are housed under the Portland Business Alliance, which is the Chamber of Commerce. They're the largest chamber of commerce in our state. And the work we do, we work with employers on their equity, inclusion, and diversity work. We know that I'm going to focus more on women of color, but we do focus on people of color. But we do want to help employers become a more equitable, inclusive, diverse workforce. So we help the employer side, and so that they will be a more welcoming place for women of color. We are a membership organization with employers. We have over 214 members right now, and they have access to a lot of different programs that I'll talk about a little bit later. We also have a job board that reaches 7,500 people in our communities of color. So if you're a member organization, you can post jobs on our website, and then we push them out into the communities of color. So hopefully that they will see them and apply for these positions.
I had one job, just turn the light on. You mentioned that you work with employers on equity work. Will you give us just a basic primer on the difference between equality and equity, particularly in the workplace?
Yes, so there's a lot of confusion sometimes when I'm out in working with employers on the difference between equality and equity. So how many of you out there know the difference? Raise your hand. No? Oh, good. So a few. So I put these 3 different examples of equality and equity up because all of them have people who like them and there's people who hate them. So I decided to throw all of them up there. But basically, very short, equality is really about everybody getting the same. So in the photo on your left-hand side, so the fence, each of the little boys has the same box, so everyone gets the same thing. So what's fair, what's equal, but then is it really the right thing to do? Because the little boy that's standing on the single box, he still can't see over the fence to the ball game. So the equity is all about getting what people need. So the tall boy obviously doesn't need a box, but the little boy does. So he gets 2 boxes and the tall boy gets 0 boxes. The other is the racetrack. So if you all start at the same place, that's fair and equal, but then when you get to the corner, that's really about equity. That's where equity and equality changes, right? So the different staggered starts on the racetrack. And the one on the bottom, I like, it's the same idea of the one on the top left, but it's looking at just different things that make it inequitable. So the ground goes lower and everybody's standing on the single box and they still can't see, but the kids are all the same height. And then I threw the last one in there on justice. It's like, really, we should just rip down the fence. So anyway, does that that help explain the difference between equity and equality for all of you? Great.
Thanks, Mari. Will you tell us about some of Partners in Diversity's programs?
Yes, so some of the ways we help women of color is to really start at the top. We believe that the CEO or the president or whoever is at the top of that organization really owns this work, and they are accountable for the success or the non-success of it being implemented in their organization. So we work with them directly, and it's a peer group, so they like to work with each other. They're not going to necessarily want to be in a room with people who are lower than them, but they like being in a room with other peers. So we work with them on just understanding of what diversity, equity, and inclusion is, their job as leader in that organization, and their role in being accountable for the success again, and really owning it. We found that if they don't own it, then it won't be successful. So no matter if you have HR or diversity, equity, and inclusion employees in your organization, if the CEO doesn't believe in this work, it's not going to happen. One other program we do is called Breakfast for Champions. And so this is where we work with HR and diversity practitioners, sharing best practices. We actually do a lot of trainings for them. And it's it's an opportunity for them to also build their own network with each other, because it can be lonely work if you're the only person in that organization that does this work. So here you can build your own network to help. And then this is our most popular event that we have. It's called Say Hey. And so for women of color, this is a great way to meet other women of color in a large setting of 500 to 700 people. And the purpose of this event is to really introduce new professionals of color who have moved to Oregon and Southwest Washington. So for instance, Patricia and I are not from here, but when I came here, this event did not exist. And for me, it was very hard to get ingrained in my community, to find other people who look like me, because my working situation was very non-diverse. I was the only woman of color at the leadership table, and so again, there was no one to ask, where's the Asian community? So Say Hey brings all these people together. We get introduced to the community, and then be able to bond, find people that we can find out questions like, where can I get my hair done? Or where's the church? Or where are all the ethnic-based organizations that I want to get involved in? That's a very important step to getting people who move here ingrained in our community, because we also know that if they don't get ingrained here, they'll leave after 1 or 2 years. And we have seen a lot of people leaving lately. And part of it is because they weren't able to find their community, not necessarily because they didn't like their job.
Let's build on that for a minute. All right, what would you say are, from where you sit, the 1 to 2 biggest barriers for women, particularly women of color, in the 21st century workplace?
Barriers. I would say access to leadership positions. I think that that's probably the one place where I don't see a lot of women of color in leadership positions in this state. There's really dismal, and I'm going to talk from more of the business side. So there's very dismal statistics out there nationwide about women of color not being seen in the C-suite. The C-suite is CEO, CFO, COO, that area. So I think for Asians, it's like 2.4%. For Hispanics, it's like 4%. I think blacks is about the same. And so for women of color, that is a huge barrier for us, is we are not seen as leaders for organizations. So I feel like that is something that we need to really work on and be able to find sponsors and mentors that will help us pull us up that ladder. And for Asians, we call it the bamboo ceiling, and break that bamboo ceiling.
You mentioned networking and Say Hey and some of the other programs that Partners in Diversity underwrites and supports. Can you talk a little bit about why networking is so important for women of color in particular?
So for people of color, I think networking is, and especially women, it's a hard thing to do. We tend to grow up with, and I'm going to speak for Asians, we tend to grow up with cultural values that tell us to work really hard, keep our head down, don't make waves. So when we're out networking, that kind of becomes a negative word, and it looks like you're brown-nosing or you're not doing your job because you're over there talking to people. But so I think there's that change of culture to really understand why networking is really important and that we all should do it. So no matter if you're diverse or not diverse, networking is really important to being able to build our friends, our access to be able to grow our own career. So this is, when you're out, it's not just about talking about small things, but it really is making those connections so that next time you want to look for a job, you have access to somebody you already know, or if you need advice about something, you have somebody to call, or anything that you need, that network is something that you can use to help yourself. And I think that's really important for women, especially women of color, to understand how important it is to get out there and get out of your comfort zone. It's not easy and it's not fun sometimes in the beginning, but once you get out of your comfort zone and practice talking to other people and really building those connections, it really is a lot more fun. Plus, you've just expanded some of your friends' network as well. So I think it's very important for our own career advancement to get out and network.
You mentioned to me earlier that Partners in Diversity also does research work. Will you talk just a moment about that and talk about how the research has helped women of color in particular?
Yes. Oops. I don't know what happened there. There we go. Okay, so we do research work. One of the projects we just finished a couple years ago was on building a diverse workforce. And so this work was really important because one of the questions I get asked a lot from employers is that they struggle to find people of color to hire. And so we decided to find out, and I know that there's a lot of people out there in the communities of color that are looking for great jobs. And so we decided to do this research piece to find out what the barriers were for people of color, especially women of color, in finding great jobs. And we actually worked with the Oregon tradeswomen on this project, so I'm sorry Kelly's not here. But what we found that for people of color, they found jobs through friends and families, and most employers are just posting jobs online or in newspapers, and that is not getting the attention. So my job after we did this research, was to really work with employers on changing the way that they recruit and helping them to find and be in the places where people of color, especially women of color, are, to help get them to know who they are and then be interested in applying for jobs. So this work, we were able to also help the communities of color with posting things on our website about where they can actually find jobs, because that was another thing we heard. Not only did they find jobs through friends and families, but they also didn't know where to look for jobs. And here and in this region alone, we have 88 nonprofits that work on building workforce, yet none of the people we interviewed knew anything about these organizations. So this work is really important to help bridge that gap between the employers and the great jobs that they have that pay living wage and to those communities.
Thank you so much. I love that point about discovering sort of a vital disconnect around recruitment, and instead of encouraging folks of color and women of color to change their practices, you all encouraged employers to change their recruitment practices.
Yes,
so I think we'll be revisiting the institutional and structural changes that we need to make, rather than simply asking women and folks of color to change their practices and behaviors to fit the current standard, which clearly isn't working for them. Great. Patricia, I think we'll move on to you next, if you don't mind. Would you tell us in a few short sentences what Morrison and Child Family Services does and what you do there?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say good evening. And How many of you out there are baby boomers? So I can identify with quite a few of you. Thank you for having us. Morrison Child and Family Services is a nonprofit, and they offer assistance to family, kiddos as we call them, in regard to trauma-induced circumstances that have a negative impact on their well-being. So we support families and children in a variety of ways. We have day treatment, we have day clinics, we have residential programs. We also offer assistance to those who find themselves in our community without a parent or guardian, and we provide them with legal support and housing as their cases are litigated through the immigration system.
From where you sit, what would you say are 1 to 2 of the biggest barriers to women's equitable and healthy participation in the workforce in the 21st century?
And since I'm a baby boomer, I'm allowed to forget. So I forgot to answer Emily's question about what I do. Well, I am the Director of Equity, Inclusion, and Sanctuary. Some of you may wonder, what is Sanctuary? Sanctuary is a trauma-informed model that allows us to be more effective and efficient in our care and treatment of our external clients. And that model starts with us having a trauma-informed perspective with each other. And we also pass on that knowledge, that insight to our clients as we engage with them. So for Morrison Child and Family Services, I had the distinct privilege of remodeling their equity and inclusion program and administering their sanctuary model.
Fantastic. So from your perspective, particularly I think I would say for vulnerable women who have faced trauma, adversity, and stress, or from kids who are coming out of those circumstances, what are the biggest barriers to healthy participation in a 21st century workplace?
Well, I think the biggest barrier is something that, for whatever reason, eludes us, and that is that we have systems and institutions that have historically been in place that are designed to benefit one culture over other cultures. So I refer to that culture as dominant culture. I refer to other cultures as subordinate cultures. And those systems have been in place for many, many years. And in order for us to have meaningful parity and to reduce the trauma of those with marginalized identities, we're going to have to interrupt those systems and look at them from a perspective of, as we do with the sanctuary model, not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you. And in the case of those who experience trauma because of marginalization based on their identities, which can be race or gender or ethnicity, we're going to have to flip the switch and think, what is it that we are doing that's going to interrupt those inequitable outcomes and allow us to achieve equitable outcomes?
I'd like to dig into that a little bit, particularly around the history of women in the workforce. You and I were chatting earlier about this. I certainly was taught, I assume many folks who went to schools in the U.S. in dominant culture schools with dominant culture curriculums, that women entered the workforce en masse after World War II. We have a lot of prominent Nobel laureate economists who said that the biggest change to the workforce in the 20th century was the mass entry of women into the workforce. And that's a lie. Because what we know from the historical data and what was completely erased from the history of women in the workforce is that women of color and low-income women have been in the workforce for centuries. There was no way for them not to participate in the workforce. And their participation in the workforce actually made it possible for affluent and middle-income, often white women, to not participate in the workforce because of their paid and unpaid labor in the home and in caregiving responsibilities. So can we talk about that narrative for a minute and the many other ways in which marginalized women, women of color, low-income women, women who've experienced trauma have been written out of the narrative, and how we are not designing the systems with them in mind?
When I first received the invitation to spend time with all of you this evening, I was a bit concerned because I did not identify with women's rights and women's issues and women's challenges. The reason I did not identify with those is because my oppression of race has always taken the lead over any type of gender or femininity or any type of experience of not having gender equity. And so I thought, I don't understand really, nor do I have an appreciation for what the challenges are, because my lens is clouded. One of the things we talk about in our dismantling systemic racism work is the identity of internalized racial oppression. And that's an identity that has to constantly be managed because it does cloud things. And so when I think about marginalized women, especially women of color, low-income women, and what their rights are, all I can think of is the intersectionality of oppression that they struggle with, and race always rises to the top. Some people always wonder, why does that always come up? Why does that always bubble up? And I say, and many push back and say, I simply don't accept that, which certainly is their rights. But I always say, everything's about race. And so when we think about that experience, when I think about my experience as a baby boomer and my mom's experience and my sister's experience and my aunt's experience, it has a different perspective, and that is just trying to overcome what it's like in day-to-day life to be a person of color in America. And then I think in terms of how is that oppression going to be addressed from a feminist perspective? I also recall how disengaged women of color were in the suffrage movement, even though they had very much to contribute. And as Emily mentioned earlier, women of color have always been infused into the workforce out of necessity. What they were not allowed to experience was a growth of career or occupation or talent because of that need to meet fundamental basic requirements for living, food and shelter, and then having to do that, to meet those needs in ways that didn't make allowances for their roles as mothers and wives.
Patricia, will you talk to us about some of the learnings and the takeaways, if your work at Morrison, and what Morrison has learned in terms of what can be supportive for some of our most vulnerable families, especially when you're talking about interacting with the workforce? What do some solutions look like? How can we do better?
Well, I'm very pleased to share that Morrison has taken a big step when they invested in the sanctuary model, because if you recall, the sanctuary model is around being trauma informed and how you engage, and also if you have clients, how you engage with clients. And in our case, our clients are the kiddos who suffer from trauma that has been created beyond their wills or rights, trauma that they have to live with. Well, I always parallel that with the trauma of being a person of color, because you are who you are. You are who you are when you show up. You have no control over how you are going to be engaged in a society that devalues you because of how you show up. So with Morrison engaging in that sanctuary model and really thinking in terms of what it's like to engage around trauma and be trauma informed, and connecting that with those with marginalized identities living constantly in trauma, then that really prepared us to move ahead with a more narrow focus around our equity and inclusion work. And so, as I mentioned earlier, and when I talked about how our systems and institutions are designed to benefit one culture over other cultures, one of the things we decided to address in our work is to interrupt that inequity in what we do. So we're focusing on a dismantling systemic racism model, and our business case is that the human experience is trauma. How much more so is it traumatic for those who come from marginalized communities with marginalized identities? And so by simply focusing on the how did we get here and how do we interrupt that, we're able to have a very sobering experience around how we want to do our work to make sure that we offer our services to everyone and that we truly represent internally and externally the community that we reside in.
Thanks so much, Patricia. Lily, thanks for being here. Can you give us a few short sentences about what Family Forward does and what you do there?
Hello. Oh, it's been on the whole time. Hi. My name is Lily. I'm the political director at Family Forward Oregon. We're an advocacy organization that works to change both our policies and our culture to value caregiving. So that means that we bring together mothers and other caregivers to look, and thank you, Patricia, to look at the intersection of race, class, and gender as it relates to who's caregiving and why, and how that impacts their ability to thrive financially, emotionally, mentally, physically. And so we really focus on organizing women across race and class to make change, particularly for things like paid family and medical leave, affordable childcare, equal pay for equal work, access to retirement security, all the things that allow women to thrive.
What are, from where you sit, 1 to 2 of the biggest barriers to women's equitable and healthy participation in the workforce in the 21st century?
Thank you. Well, I would argue that I would challenge, and I'm not blaming anyone for this, I would challenge equitable participation in the workforce. I think we've spent a lot of time in dominant culture focusing on making all of our lives look the way we think sort of white men's lives should look: work all the time, bring home the bacon, never care, never worry about anything except for being productive in a certain way. And so we've, over the last century, actually tried to make all women, white women, women of color, look more like leading men's lives instead of trying to find a true balance between what it means to be a member of the workforce and what it means to be a member of your community and your family. And I actually wanted to highlight and uplift something that you said about our culture privileging sort of dominant culture in our policies and in the way that we actually write law and the way that then our culture interprets that law and the way that impacts people day to day. So one of the things that we really work on is intersectionality and caregiving. So that means who gets to care, who doesn't get time to care, and why. And I just want to point out that this organization was started and talking about World War II and what that meant for women joining the workforce. And in fact, we actually started having a culture of white dominance when white Europeans came over to the United States, and they actually enslaved other people. And so Black and African women have been working as caregivers for white folks since sort of the days that we, quote, founded this country in its current formation. And throughout that, Black women and immigrant women have been working, and they've been working in caregiving positions, often for white families, for centuries. And so when we're talking about who's in the workforce and who's not, and I thank you both for talking about that, what we're talking about is really shifting that very long-term dynamic about who's been working in paid caregiving. That's women of color, that's particularly Black women and immigrant women, and currently immigrant Latino women, and who's in the paid workforce making more money. That's often white women and white men, and how we balance it so that everyone has access to the ability to thrive at work, but also actually thrive at home in a way that doesn't make any one person make that constrained choice. So that's a very long answer.
No, I appreciate that. My next question was actually, why and how has the white, male, straight, able-bodied experience of working in usually a corporate style office building and being the sole breadwinner and coming home to someone who's had a full day of caretaking. Why do we consistently continue to push that as the norm and tell everybody who does not have that experience that they need to fit to that? And how can we disrupt that narrative?
Thank you. Okay, I want to pull it back for a second. Do me all a favor. Do me all a favor. Please raise your hand if someone gave birth to you. Okay, cool. So we all have a little bit of shared humanity here. And all of us needed care at some stage. And my guess is we've needed care at other times in our lives, and that we have provided care to other people. And if we're women, we certainly have, whether it was for a family member, a friend, a loved one, a neighbor, a child of your own, or someone else's. And the reason that these things haven't shifted is that it's all good and fine for us to get the vote, but we don't actually value that invisible care work that all of us are doing. It is the work that makes all other work possible. And we don't value it specifically because the paid part of it, whether you're providing childcare, elder care, care for someone with a disability, is disproportionately done by women of color. And the unpaid care work is done by mostly women and all women. And so what that means is even when we I don't like to get into, deep economic analysis at every 7:45 p.m. event. But I do like to say one of the things is when we think about our economy, right, and we turn on OPB or whatever it is that we listen to, and we hear all about how the economy is doing. But what we don't hear about is how caregiving and how the work, all that, I like to call it the executive functioning, all the planning of our lives, all of the day-to-day drudgery or sometimes joy of our lives actually counts towards the greater community. And not just in a loving, caring way, which it should, and it does, but actually economically what it does, what it's valued. So how it hasn't changed because our policies haven't caught up, and hint, they haven't caught up because the people who are making those policies do not reflect or represent the people who are really living in our communities and experiencing what we're all experiencing. And that's partially to do, that's to do with a million things, but it partially has to do with how we choose what issues matter to us and how we choose which issues to talk about in events like this, or who we elect, or how we push for what laws. When we really take what I hear you, Patricia, saying, and I really love the sanctuary model, but also the model of looking at oppression. So the reason it hasn't changed is because we haven't taken a model of really evaluating what it is we value, what policies we'd like to change based on this gender and racial justice lens, looking at who is really impacted. Women are 2/3 or 3/4 of all breadwinners in the families in the United States. They provide the vast, vast majority of caregiving. They used to call it, women had the second shift of coming home from work. They call it the third shift, thank you, the internet, for making your life so planned that you get no time. Women in the US sleep less than other women across the world. And that's because we're not changing our policies to really reflect the actual lived experiences.
Thanks, Lily. I recently, I think there's been a flurry of articles lately in the New York Times and Slate talking about this sort of exact conflict between care and life and work. And for a long, long time, how many people have heard the term work-life balance? Right? And that sort of implies that if you could just spin all the plates and stand on the skateboard with one leg and breathe right at the right time, that you would somehow achieve all of the things, rather than it being structurally impossible for you to meet all of the demands that are on you as both a full-time caregiver and a full-time employee and a full-time person of color or marginalized identity trying to navigate the world. So can each of you actually take a moment and speak a little bit, either from your personal lived experience about this work-life conflict, or about what you see in the workplace, in your own workplace, about what you see structurally and policy-wise? Speak to that conflict and how it's not really a balance, but in fact a conflict.
Well, I'll go first. I know that I touted that Morrison has invested greatly in a sanctuary model that's focused around trauma-informed care, but when I look around my community at the office that I work in. And so let me just sort of paint the picture. I sit in the seat of power, so I'm on the floor where the officers and the other directors live. And as much as one of the tools in our toolkit around sanctuary care is self-care, around safety plans, around things that nurture us so that we can manage, I see a workaholic experience, really. I see us not engaging in self-care, not trying to be safe for ourselves or for our others, but wolfing down our lunch and trudging ahead because we're a nonprofit. We have things to do. We don't have the resources to do everything, so we just have to do it. And I scratch my head and I wonder, so what is this about? Is it a male-centered dominant culture value? And I would say yes.
As someone who wolfed down their lunch in their car today, do not eat burritos while you're driving on the highway. That's a lesson I learned today. I definitely relate to that experience, and I think how I see it is that we organize women from across the state to really understand that their caregiving experiences are not about their individual failures, but about either a lack of a system or a broken system, and a system that was actually designed to exclude some people and to harm many, and actually harms all of us at varying degrees. And so I get to hear from women all the time. It is my luck that I work in a community of women who talk a lot about, it's not actually work-life balance. There's a new term that I really like, that instead of the glass ceiling, too many women are stuck on the sticky floor, and they can't even seem to get up. And so what I hear from women is women who have 2 kids, they work full-time jobs, childcare costs more than they could ever dream to spend on college, and they can't figure out what to do and how to do it. Their housing situation is unstable, they have limited family support, costs are rising, and there's kind of nowhere to turn, and that's part of their isolation. And so I have spent a lot of time thinking about the fact that if we can build across community and across race and class, especially mothers and other caregivers, to actually ask for more, that we will have less of this conflict, because I think work-life balance is kind of a BS term that is absolutely about individuals, and instead we can say, what is it that we value? What actually gives to our economy and to our individual selves and our communities? And when we focus less on, like, how will I make this work? And we focus more on what are the dang policies that need to change so that we have, like, true equity, freedom, and justice. I feel more empowered by that conversation.
So Lily, I'm glad you said that work-life balance is BS, because I think that we always get these questions on, so women are always up at the front talking, and the question comes up like, how do you do the work-life balance? It's like you don't. It really is up to you as an individual and how you do it. And it is hard because I think there's a lot of expectations put upon us by society to do certain things and be certain ways. I believe that in the business arena that women, that's why women have to be in leadership positions, and that's why women have to be at the table of conversations, because the policy piece is where that whatever you can hope to have over work-life balance, or at least just be more equitable, is going to happen. I talked to a woman from, I better not say the name of the company, but she is the first woman that is in the leadership team of this organization. It's a very male-dominated, not necessarily white male, but male-dominated organization. And she got married and had children, and she said there were no policies for women to leave the country, what are we going to do now that she's going to be gone for this time? And she was really surprised herself that she was the first woman that had a baby in the leadership team of this organization. So therefore, there was no policies to kind of handle it. So I think about that and saying, this is why women need to be at the table, and we need to make space for them. And even if you're not a leader and you are a woman in an organization, your management team should be asking you to be involved in those. It's called engagement. And so engage with your employees all the way down the ranks to find the best solutions to situations, including these types of things. And I will say one more thing, just to, for men, in positive thing for men, I have seen more men get very involved in pickup and drop off of their kids, which I've never seen before. And it is definitely the younger generation, but I've been really impressed by that. And there's one guy I know who says, I block my calendar off at 2 p.m. every Wednesday because that's when I have to pick up my kids, and that's it. Like, I don't do any meetings, I don't care what's going on, I am there for my kids. And I just thought that's really great. And hopefully we'll see more of that, or we are seeing more of that.
Terrific. I think we have time for just a little bit more of discussion, and then we'll move to some questions. So we've been beautifully theoretical, we've been a little bit personal. I would like to be very, very tactical for a minute and discuss actual either workplace or state or local policies that we think would make a material difference for women, particularly women of color, in the workplace. You can give any example and give any rationale. I'll give you a little bit of a head start by talking about 3 related to salary that I think would have a big impact. The first is asking for salary history, which is now no longer legal in the state of Oregon thanks to the Pay Equity Act. It's really damaging for women and folks of color to have their future salary determined by their past salary, knowing the inequities and often in and out of the workplace and lack of access to particular career tracks or educational opportunities. Basing a future salary on a previous salary condemns women and folks of color to a lower track for their entire career trajectory. And it's not meaningful when you're engaging in the salary process. Next is salary transparency. And that is being incredibly transparent with your entire workforce about what levels people are at and encouraging and allowing them to surface and talk about that. It used to be illegal to talk with your colleagues about your compensation, which had the effect of disguising discrimination and pay inequities for decades, if not centuries. And the third is related to salary negotiation. We know that salary negotiation really disproportionately affects women and folks of color, that they are punished for negotiate. They don't negotiate in the first place, and then when they do, they're often punished for it and seen as being domineering or grabby or somehow otherwise undeserving, whereas when white men negotiate, it's seen as a positive trait. So 3 things related to salary that we can know and mitigate at the institutional level and at the structural level. And thankfully, Oregon has taken steps to mitigate 2 out of the 3. Anybody else want to go next?
I will go, only because you mentioned a policy that my organization is leading on currently. Family Forward leads the Time to Care Coalition, and we are working to pass a universal paid family and medical leave program in Oregon so that you don't have to win the boss lottery to take a meaningful amount of time off, either for the birth or adoption or fostering of a child, or for your own illness to care for an ill loved one, either for a long-term illness, for care to move into a care home, intermittent care, or for somebody who really needs maybe regular support with something like dialysis or cancer treatment. So we are working on a policy. I always like to tell folks that Germany has had paid family and medical leave since 1883. So we're good. We could try it. And we are one of only 2 countries in the world that has no mandated paid leave of any kind. So we are in good company with Papua New Guinea. And Oregon, if we passed it in 2019, that's a universal paid family and medical leave policy, we would be the 7th location in the country. And we think this is profoundly important for gender justice, for racial justice. This will have a deep impact on communities who one day or 1 week away from work is the difference between being able to put food on the table or not. And it's actually a really, what you spoke about, fathers and men being involved in caregiving, is that part of our work is to absolutely center and focus on the people who are most impacted by lack of access to supports. And that is mothers of color and mothers and other caregivers. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't positively impact everyone, because what we know is that when people have paid family and medical leave, men are also offered the dignity to take time off to care for their families too, which we know they want to, and there often hasn't been access. Because if I'm sure that there were men who had children in that workplace before she did, and they probably didn't feel like they could ask or like they had right to a policy. And right now, only 15% of all Americans have paid family and medical leave at all, so most of us don't. So we're working on that, and I will say, we can keep going, but I have some postcards and a little one-pager in the back, and you can sign up to learn more about family leave if you'd like.
So I have a couple thoughts. So one is some of the work that we've done in the past at Partners in Diversity has been around immigrants and refugees that come here with advanced degrees. So meaning they're doctors, lawyers, teachers, nurses, psychologists, pharmacists, and they're not able to work here in Oregon because their credential is not recognized by Oregon. And this is many states as well. But there's a lot of women of color in this group that have these skills. We need them in our schools. We need more teachers who look like our students. We need more teachers who are bilingual. And we are not able to put these women to work. So consequently, where they end up working is in a minimum wage job somewhere, and sometimes they might have 2 jobs because they can't afford to live on just that one wage when they have children and a family. So, we're working on trying to ask the licensure boards to help find pathways for these professionals of color who come here and are not using their skills and not adding to the economic development of Oregon. We did some research, and there's 15,000 immigrants and refugees with advanced degrees here, but none of them are working in their field. So if you want to talk about money that Oregon needs to do all these things, that's equivalent to $27 million in income tax that's not being realized by the state of Oregon because these immigrants and refugees are not allowed to work in their field. And so they're again, working in low wage, low pay, driving Uber cabs, whatever, and not being able to utilize their skills. The other is leadership training for culturally tailored leadership training for women of color. A lot of times our cultural values get in the way of us moving up in the workforce, especially in the business corporate world. So really understanding how our cultural values show up as behaviors in the workplace that don't identify us as leaders. So that is an investment that I want business leaders to invest in their employees of color, because a lot of times they will say, oh yeah, we have people of color, but they're not leadership material, and that really annoys me. So I think that there are programs out there that do culturally tailored work. So invest in your employees, get them into these leadership programs, and you will definitely see a shift in their behavior, because it's not that they are capable of leadership. They just need a little bit of help to get there. So it's a cheap investment in the long term.
Patricia?
So for my response, I think about my experiences, and I think about anecdotal experiences that have been shared with me. And one thing that always comes back, and keep in mind that Again, I'm speaking out of my identity, and what that means and how that tends to overshadow some things. So hopefully you'll bear with me just a little bit around these comments. But again, I go back to how everything that we engage, everything that we encounter around how to thrive and survive, particularly as women of color, has been in place and designed by something that's completely different from who we are, who the essence of our being is. And so how do we fit? How do we fit? Not in a way that we're going to be accommodated, that things are going to be shifted to make allowances for who we are, but that the acknowledgement is that we don't fit into that dominant culture mode. And so there are consequences for not fitting into that mode. So I think the thing that would help us to survive and to thrive would be just a sobering acknowledgement of that reality, and then a commitment to appreciate, as Mari said, that the cultural nuances that make us who we are and that make our society so rich are not deficits. And so as we view and engage women, and particularly women of color, thinking in terms of what is it about the thing that I administer, the system that I inherited, the institution that I manage, that's prohibitive to someone that looks like me. And how can I shift that perspective to make it truly equitable? So I'm talking very globally and maybe a bit abstractly, but in my 30 plus years of experience in transactional equity, it has all boiled down to that I, as a person of color and as a woman, am in conflict with society based on the systems, the structures, the processes, the procedures that don't recognize who I am and don't understand what my needs are so that I can thrive and survive right along with others, with dominant culture and others. So I can't seem to escape my reality, that reality for me. And I'm always advocating that let's just take a different look. Let's take a different look, a different lens, interrupt what we do and how we do it. And will we see some different outcomes if we committed to it and we do our due diligence, we take that sobering experience around how we got here? I think we will see some different outcomes. And I think they'll be global. And I think they'll be for everybody.
I love that. I think that's a beautiful point to end on, because we were talking about a great deal of specificity. And we also know that if women of color, women who are engaged in caregiving had been involved in the construction of those policies from the get-go, we would not have to be talking about changing them now. They would have been in place from the beginning. And to Patricia's point, again, I think, I'm not sure if folks have heard this example, but when you talk about making policies or even decisions, that when you put the folks who are most vulnerable or most impacted at the center, that the policy that you come up with tends to be good for everybody. It's not that it's terrible for the wealthy straight white man at the top of the pile. For instance, curb cuts, the cuts in the curb when you cross at a crosswalk, or so those were put in place with the Americans for Disabilities Act. Very important for folks in wheelchairs. Also important for moms with strollers. elderly folks who have trouble with a big step, my friend Amy, who will trip over absolutely anything at any moment. So we all, in fact, benefit from those curb cuts, even though we designed them for the folks who are most impacted at every single intersection. So it is that the recentering, but it's not. It's a lifting up of all. It's not in the recentering. Nobody loses. It just reshifts it so that not 98% of us who are not at the top of the pile currently are losing. We have some great audience questions. If you have questions, please make sure to grab an index card and get them up here in the next couple of minutes. Great. This question I think everybody could probably speak to, but only the folks who feel so moved. What exactly do you try to get CEOs to do? What steps do CEOs need to take to change their organizations? I think we just heard some specific policies, but I'll open it up for folks to.
The steps that CEOs need to take is, one, they need to own it. I think that is probably one of the hardest parts, is to really understand the value of having a diverse or workforce. But if you really look at it, it's going to come down to money. And this is one of the ways that they can understand that the fate of their business actually relies upon them really understanding and embracing diversity, because one, the future workforce that we have coming right behind us are very diverse. The kids in our K-12 schools, just in this area, are almost all over 50% kids of color right now. So that's what's coming up in a few years. Right now, the baby boomers are going to all be retiring in droves. So there's going to be a lot of jobs out there that currently there's not a pipeline to fill. So embracing culture and policies now that will make their organization welcoming is really important, because kids that are coming up in the pipeline that are kids of color, if they don't really see opportunities for them or a good place for them to work, they won't work there. So it'll be much more difficult. And the buying power of the communities of color is growing ginormously. So if you are not making goods or services that actually appeal to the communities of color, then your business won't be able to survive. So having employees internally that understand their community and what they want and need as far as goods and services will really help benefit your organization. So I think from a CEO perspective, a lot of times it comes down to understanding the money piece and the business case for being a more inclusive organization. So understanding, adopting, and then owning it, accountability, hiring people to do their diversity, equity, inclusion work, and standing behind that work, doing assessments within their organization to find out how their own employees feel about that organization is a good starting point, and then you can build a strategy from there on the work that you'll do internally to change the culture.
I think that's fantastic. You're clearly an expert. And I want to say something, I wouldn't call it controversial, but maybe it might be a little in this crowd. But the other thing is, if you're a white person who is in charge, you might want to think about how long you've been in your job or in your position and what you're doing to actually mentor, support, and create an environment for someone else to take that job and to step aside. That includes state legislators, folks like me who have been in my job a while, and other folks, to really think about it's not actually just about like, why couldn't they make it? It's like, what position am I in? And what have I been doing, and where's the space, and how am I setting the conditions so that this is a good job for anyone who might want to take it, and that it's the right place and a welcoming place for folks who might not be in the dominant culture.
Brilliant. But I would just like to ask that one of the things that I think is a barrier, to borrow a term, the elephant in the room, is understanding what's at stake. And in understanding what's at stake, you have to understand what brought us to this place around inequity and exclusion, and why is that making me feel uncomfortable or threatened. So having that experience and working through that and understanding that the privilege that you hold is not necessarily a deficit, it's not necessarily something that you are directly responsible for it's an unearned privilege. So leaving the fragility aside and the guilt aside and understanding that equity is not going to compromise what you have, but you can use your privilege and power to make a change. So that's a negotiation, and that's a commitment that I think those of dominant culture, those of privilege, have to decide to make. And once they make it, the practical aspects that Lily and Mari shared will be amazingly simple. But coming to that determination around understanding that I can make this change and I won't lose anything, and I understand how we got there. I think that's what is going to have the greatest impact for a CEO or anyone else in a position of authority and power, and that'll be the incentive that'll allow them to move forward.
Spent a lot of time talking about white men in roles of power, particularly CEOs. 37 out of 39 publicly traded companies in Oregon currently have a white man at the helm, and I think it's critically important for white men in those roles to understand that while being a white man is their identity, it's not their destiny in terms of their worldview, because the patriarchy and dominant culture are separate from being a white man. And just because you're a white man does not mean you have to uphold patriarchy, and it does not mean you have to uphold dominant culture. In fact, we need white men, we need white women, we need all kinds of folks, particularly those who hold a great deal of positional and identity-related privilege, to break down those systems of patriarchy and dominant culture, because they hurt us all. And I recently, I came to this theory, and please panelists debunk this theory if you think it's wrong, that in thinking about CEOs and leaders, I pretty much am sitting in a space where I think that the change of an organization cannot outpace the personal growth and journey of its leader or leaders. I don't think I've ever seen a case where an organization really was moving to dismantle these barriers for women, for folks of color, to dismantle the patriarchal and dominant culture things that are damaging everybody and holding everybody back. I haven't seen those championed or truly led by a leader that wasn't doing their own personal work to dive into their own identity, their own privilege, their own ways that's been manifesting in their life. So please check me on that, panelist, if you think I'm off base. Because this systemic work, turns out, is in fact deeply personal.
I absolutely agree with that.
All right, we have a couple minutes. Here's a fun one. This I think is particularly for Lily, but please other folks chime in. If care workers are getting paid so miserably, but care is so unaffordable, what's the deal with that?
I love that question. That's what I spend many hours a week thinking about. That's because it's a broken system. So we have what I would call a market failure, which is that, of course, you're saying that your average care worker in Oregon gets paid $10 an hour, which is lower than minimum wage. I can explain why that is. And your average family, as you know, if you are yourself or have a family member who needs elder care, it is bonkers how expensive it is. Child care is getting up there. And so the reason for that is because care is a part of our social infrastructure, right? So we've done all this work to make what I would call traditionally men's jobs good jobs. So we built roads and bridges and we made them good union jobs. And what we haven't done is made women's jobs good jobs. So we still pay care providers miserable wages. They don't have access to regular union, like access to joining a union. They don't have access to career benefits, ladders or lattices. But also, we actually don't acknowledge that this isn't a system that can survive without public funding. So just like K through 12, just like Social Security, just like Medicaid, whether those things are all working or not, we can have another discussion. But This is a social infrastructure system that we need to choose to invest in so that everyone who's providing childcare has a good job and can provide for their own family, and that everyone who needs childcare can access that childcare at the hours they need, in the type of facility they need, whether that's with their friend, family, or neighbor, or it's in a childcare center that's culturally and linguistically appropriate and that meets their financial needs. The way we do that is we are going to have to fund state systems with things like paid family and medical leave. We are going to have to improve and build on our elder care system in a way that properly funds all of us having access to not just health care, but caregiving, because that's really what's happening. And I want to say that the #1 growing job in Oregon is caregiving for our elders. But we don't talk about that being a good job. When we talk about social, like, infrastructure and developing our economy, when have you guys read an article that said, the newest job, the best job? And so in order to change that, we're actually gonna have to change entire systems to fund these programs.
So Lily, are you saying that those who are actually providing the care, the workers, they're not receiving compensation, but the cost of the care is exorbitant? So are we talking about just pure old-fashioned greed?
No, that is such a great question. Thank you. So normally I would say yes about some things, but in this case, actually, the people who are providing the care are not running away with millions. They're actually suffering. Their families are too, and that's because if you imagine, so it's not like, okay, when you think about economics, when you think about making computers, right? Eventually we make all this new technology, and eventually only one person needs to make thousands of computers. Maybe they started making one a day. Now they make 1,000 a day. And then we can keep paying them the same rate or a little more. When we're talking about caregiving jobs, there's only so many babies anyone can watch. Right now, for instance, I just always like to share this, that the limit on how many babies you can care for at once is 4 if they're under a year old. I'm just 18 months old, excuse me. I just want to tell you, if you've ever been alone with 4 under 18 months old, that's plenty. I would say too many. And you can only care for so many of your elders or people with disabilities depending on their care needs at once. So you're never going to be able to produce, right? You're never going to make a profit off of caregiving. You're never going to be able to say, well, fine, we'll put grandma in and all of these people in this care home, and they'll have one nurse and they'll have one care provider. That does happen. You've seen it. It really doesn't work. And that care provider, we can only afford to pay them so much because we can't charge families anymore. So just like with our schools or our roads or bridges, we have decided that we're not going to make people like dig out and make their own sewer because it's unaffordable and it's untenable. And how do we connect all the sewers? There's a lot of questions. It's just like that. In order to do this care work en masse, we're actually going to need to have public funds pay for it so that the people in it can get paid more and the people who need it can pay less.
I love that. It's sort of, I think, of the analogy of public transportation. If we charged everybody what it actually costs to run a TriMet bus, you'd have to pay $50 every time you got on the bus. But we've decided as a community that public transportation and all of the good that comes from that, cleaner air, access, especially for folks who are most impacted, who struggle to get around, less traffic, all of that is worth investing in as a community. So we take public dollars to subsidize it, so it's only $250. Still sometimes unaffordable for folks, but it's much less and more accessible because we've decided it's a public good, and we haven't yet, because of racism, sexism, and all kinds of other isms, decided that for caregiving. Is that fair? Okay. I want to give us a few more minutes. Mari, anything you wanted to say that you forgot to say, that you want to plug, that you want to argue?
No, I think this has been a great panel. I have learned a lot myself. I hope you all have learned from my 3 actually friends up here at the table. I do think that the diversity inclusion, especially for women of color, and the needs that are out there for them are great. And there are a lot of barriers out there that we just don't think about. Even for me, I don't think about them, and so I learn along with a lot of other people, but we need again, more women in leadership positions. We need to see their voices at the table. So anything you can do in your world to help that would be appreciated.
Lily, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think I want to uplift what you said about how deeply personal all of this is, and thinking in your life, what's the one thing you could do to improve what are you involved in, and how can you change or think about your behaviors that would make what I would call political and cultural change. So what are the ways that you can engage in racial and gender justice work in a way that allows for us not just to change policies and not to just write emails to legislators, although I'd love you to do that, but is to actually also think in your day-to-day life, what are my behaviors and actions that I can shift and where I can make a positive change in women and women of color's participation as full citizens.
And just to piggyback on Lily and Mari's comments, I would just say, get comfortable with being uncomfortable. Thank you for being avid listeners and just being here. That speaks volumes. But and we share a lot of sobering concepts, information, perspectives with you. Inculcating that can be challenging. And sometimes I have a tendency of putting things off that are not comfortable or not addressing them. But I think the first step, and I invite of all of you, is to kind of think about and get uncomfortable with what we shared and work through that. And then think about, as Lily shared, how you can personify that in your behaviors. And then reach out. Challenge. Say, hey, Patricia, I don't agree with anything you said. Let's talk. Let's talk about it. Help, I'll share with you my perspective. You can share with me yours. Let's just work through this. So the first step, though, is, I think, being comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Thank you all. I want to end by lifting up, I think, a theme that we've heard many times, which is that these are real problems. The data are very clear about the hardships that women, particularly women of color, face in Oregon and in the workplace. I also know that these three fierce women wouldn't do the work that they do every single day if they didn't have hope that it could be better. If they didn't think that ultimately these are solvable problems. These are not endemic, they are not intractable, and in fact, it's the forces of the status quo that are trying to convince us that they are endemic and that they are intractable. And there are better ways, and I think that we all, four of us, deeply believe that we all can be in charge of that and in service to that. So thank you so much. Please give a hand to our wonderful panelists.
I'm going to say thank you also to the panel. Thanks very much. This was a very interesting discussion. This concludes the recorded part of our panel discussion. Thank you, and for helping us think about the challenges and opportunities that we have ahead of us. Look on the website of the League of Women Voters of Portland, lwvpdx.org, to find the Metro East Community Media schedule for rebroadcast and the Metro East YouTube recording of this program, which you can view online. Thank you to our donors, the Multnomah Bar Foundation, the Carol and Velma Sailing Foundation, and Metro East Community Media for their support of this program. Thanks to Multnomah County for the use of this space, and to our speakers and our audience and our volunteers. This has been a production of Metro East Community Media and a presentation of the League of Women Voters of Portland Education Fund. Thank you and good night.